Beneath the polished stories of victory, liberation, and national pride lies a darker record, hidden in sealed cabinets, redacted reports, and archives marked "Do not release without authorization." These were not the tales chosen for history textbooks, nor the narratives recited at memorials or victory parades. They are fragments of evidence, whispers of atrocities, and shadows of decisions that governments decided the public must never know. For decades, these files remained sealed, their pages yellowing in locked vaults, guarded by silence as much as by steel. Yet even silence erodes. Now, faint traces resurface, handwritten notes in margins, censored photographs misfiled, testimonies that slipped through censorship. Each detail adds weight to a burden of truth deliberately concealed. Tonight we open 5 of these long-buried files, 5 disturbing secrets from the Second World War, suppressed not because they lacked importance, but because their revelation threatened reputations, alliances, and the fragile balance of power in the decades that followed. As we step into these forbidden corridors of history, listen carefully. These are the words they did not want spoken, the files they hoped would remain forever in darkness. Comment what you think was the greatest secret left untold, because what follows is more than history. It is the reckoning of silence. Classified Nazi human experiments erased. The collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945 left behind more than ruins, more than shattered cities and broken armies. It left behind evidence of crimes so disturbing that even hardened investigators struggled to record them. Among these crimes were the systematic human experiments conducted inside concentration camps. Experiments designed not to heal, but to push the limits of suffering, to serve the Reich's obsession with war and control. In secret reports filed by Allied intelligence officers in the summer of 1945, names like Dachau, Ravensbrück, and Auschwitz appear again and again, not as camps, but as laboratories of horror. The chilling truth was that these experiments were not crude sadism alone. They were carefully documented, controlled, and measured in ways that mirrored legitimate research. The Nazi regime had turned human beings into unwilling test subjects, erasing their identities and reducing them to numbers on medical charts. The scope of these experiments was vast. Prisoners were placed in freezing tanks for hours to simulate the fate of Luftwaffe pilots shot down over the North Sea. Others were forced into decompression chambers, their bodies convulsing as air pressure dropped, their lungs rupturing to provide data for high-altitude aviation. At Dachau, SS doctors tested poisons and new chemical agents, injecting prisoners to study the precise timeline of organ failure. In Ravensbrück, women were deliberately wounded with shrapnel, then infected with gangrene to test experimental treatments. Even children were not spared. Twins at Auschwitz were measured, dissected, and mutilated under the hand of Dr. Josef Mengele, who pursued genetic theories with cold precision. The evidence was overwhelming, yet, in the immediate aftermath of war, not all of it was made public. The Nuremberg doctors' trial of 1946 exposed fragments of these crimes. 23 physicians and administrators stood accused of crimes against humanity, and 7 were sentenced to death. But behind the headlines, another reality was quietly unfolding. US military intelligence, aware of the potential military applications of the Nazi data, began selectively extracting and storing experiment records. The files labeled "not for court use" contained research on hypothermia, aviation medicine, chemical exposure, and wound treatment. Operation Paperclip, the American program designed to recruit German scientists, did not stop at rocket engineers like Wernher von Braun. It extended to men who had overseen medical experiments on unwilling prisoners. The logic was clear. If the knowledge could save American pilots or soldiers, then its origins could be ignored. The British government followed a similar path. In classified memoranda from the Ministry of Defense, officials debated the morality of using Nazi hypothermia data to improve survival gear for Royal Air Force crews. By 1950, elements of this research were quietly incorporated into cold water rescue manuals, stripped of context, the victims' names erased. The Soviet Union, too, exploited the remnants of Nazi research. Captured German physicians were interrogated, their files duplicated, and sent to Moscow for military and biomedical study. Across all sides, secrecy prevailed, not out of ignorance, but out of choice. To admit the use of this data was to admit complicity in perpetuating the very crimes that had shocked the world. What is most disturbing is how much has disappeared. In the archives of the US Army Surgeon General's office, entire folders relating to Dachau's hypothermia experiments are missing, their catalogue numbers recorded, but the documents absent. Survivors' testimonies speak of procedures never acknowledged in court, such as forced seawater consumption trials at Dachau, where prisoners drank chemically treated seawater until they collapsed in agony, yet records of these experiments were carefully redacted. Historians searching the archives in the 1970s encountered blacked-out pages, stamped restricted national security. Even now, many files remain classified, withheld not because of threats to security, but because of the moral stain they represent. The consequences extended beyond secrecy. In the decades following the war, survivors of Nazi medical experiments petitioned for recognition and compensation. Many were rejected. German courts, citing the absence of documentation, dismissed claims. In the United States, officials argued that the government bore no responsibility. Despite evidence that American researchers had quietly consulted Nazi data, survivors lived with the scars, amputated limbs, chronic pain, blindness, while the nations that had profited from their suffering denied them acknowledgement. This denial was itself a continuation of erasure, ensuring that the victims' voices would not interfere with military or scientific priorities. There are haunting ironies within the files. For instance, US Air Force researchers in the 1950s conducted cold exposure tests on volunteers, citing historical precedent without referencing Nazi experiments. Medical textbooks published in the 1960s included charts on hypothermia thresholds that aligned precisely with Dachau's data, but the source was disguised. When confronted, officials insisted these were independent findings. The trail of suppressed evidence is unmistakable. Governments sought to bury the link between their research and the concentration camp atrocities, crafting a narrative of purity while drawing upon poisoned knowledge. Even in the 21st century, fragments continue to emerge. In 2010, researchers uncovered photographs mislabeled in US archives, showing emaciated prisoners strapped into ice tanks. In 2015, a British historian revealed correspondence between RAF doctors discussing the usefulness of Dachau data. These discoveries confirm what survivors had always known, that their suffering was never truly erased, only hidden behind walls of classification and denial. Each rediscovery reopens a wound, not only for those who endured the experiments, but for the integrity of nations that claim to stand against barbarism. The phrase, "classified Nazi human experiments erased," is more than a file heading. It is a verdict on decades of deliberate silence. Governments sought to portray themselves as liberators, as defenders of civilization. Yet in secret, they preserved and exploited the results of the very crimes they condemned. They erased names, redacted documents, and withheld compensation, ensuring the victims remained invisible while the knowledge survived. The moral burden of this silence is profound. It forces us to ask whether survival and victory were purchased, in part with the currency of atrocity. Tonight, as these shadows are revisited, the details are no longer confined to sealed vaults. They stand as testimony that cannot be erased. The hypothermia tanks, the decompression chambers, the mutilated bodies of children, all are part of a record too disturbing to remain hidden. Governments may have buried the files, but the truth has a way of resurfacing. And in that resurfacing, the erased are remembered, not as data points or classified documents, but as human beings whose suffering was exploited and then concealed. Their voices rise through the silence, demanding to be heard, even 70 years after the pages were stamped secret and locked away. Forbidden Soviet massacres in Poland. The word Katyn carries with it the weight of silence, denial, and betrayal. In the spring of 1940, deep within the forests near Smolensk, Soviet secret police units of the NKVD carried out one of the most systematic executions of the Second World War. Over 22,000 Polish prisoners of war, military officers, police, professors, doctors, priests, and civic leaders were shot in the back of the head, their bodies buried in mass graves beneath pine trees. These men were not captured on the battlefield by chance. They were deliberately targeted as the intellectual and military backbone of the Polish state. By eliminating them, Stalin sought to decapitate Poland's leadership class and ensure that a subjugated nation would never again rise to independence. Yet for decades, this atrocity was hidden behind walls of denial, its truth drowned beneath propaganda and diplomatic convenience. The massacre began after the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in September 1939, itself a product of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. When the Red Army swept into Polish territory, nearly 250,000 soldiers and civilians were taken prisoner. Thousands were transported to camps such as Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. It was here, behind barbed wire and guarded watchtowers, that NKVD officers methodically selected their victims. Archival records reveal that on March 5, 1940, Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, presented Stalin with a memorandum recommending the special treatment of Polish prisoners. Stalin's signature, along with that of Molotov and Voroshilov, authorized the execution. From that moment, the fate of thousands was sealed. The killings were carried out with grim efficiency. Prisoners were transported in small groups, often believing they were being transferred to new camps. Instead, they were taken to secluded execution sites: Katyn Forest near Smolensk, Mednoye near Tver, Kharkiv in Ukraine, and several others. There, under the cover of night, NKVD agents forced the men to kneel. A single shot from a German-made Walther pistol to the back of the skull ensured silence. Bodies were stacked in pits, layer upon layer, with each grave holding hundreds. In Katyn alone, 8 large burial sites were dug, filled with thousands of corpses. The work was brutal, but it was systematic, designed not for spectacle, but for erasure. When Nazi forces invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and advanced on Smolensk, they uncovered the graves. By 1943, German propaganda units invited international observers, including journalists and Red Cross representatives, to witness the exhumations. Photographs from the time reveal neatly stacked corpses, their uniforms intact, Polish insignia still visible. Documents and personal effects, preserved by the soil, bore dates from the spring of 1940, clear evidence pointing to Soviet responsibility. The Germans seized on the discovery as a propaganda tool, broadcasting the atrocity as proof of Bolshevik savagery. But the Allies, locked in desperate alliance with Stalin, chose silence. To acknowledge Soviet guilt would fracture the coalition against Hitler, a price Churchill and Roosevelt were unwilling to pay. Thus began a decades-long deception. The Soviet Union categorically denied responsibility, insisting that the massacre was carried out by the Germans after their occupation of Smolensk in 1941. At the Nuremberg trials, Soviet prosecutors attempted to place the blame on the Nazis, presenting falsified reports and coerced testimonies. Western officials knew the truth. British and American intelligence files from 1943 explicitly identified the NKVD as the perpetrators. Yet these reports were locked away, classified under political sensitivity. In a 1943 cable, Winston Churchill himself admitted privately that the Soviets were responsible but ordered silence, stating, "We cannot afford to split with Stalin before Berlin is taken." For the families of the victims, the silence was devastating. Widows and children of murdered officers searched for answers, only to be met with official denials. In Poland, under Soviet domination after the war, even mentioning Katyn could lead to imprisonment. School textbooks described the massacre as a Nazi crime, and the truth was erased from public memory. The graves at Katyn became a forbidden subject, an open wound that could not be acknowledged. Survivors who dared to speak risked being branded traitors, their words suppressed by communist censors. For decades, memory itself was criminalized. The cover-up extended far beyond Poland. In the United States, a congressional committee investigated Katyn in 1951, collecting testimony from witnesses and reviewing captured German and Soviet documents. The committee concluded that the Soviets were guilty, but the findings were quietly buried, overshadowed by Cold War diplomacy. American presidents from Truman to Reagan avoided pressing the issue too directly, fearing it might destabilize already tense relations with Moscow. Only in the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to collapse, did the silence begin to break. In 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev officially admitted Soviet responsibility, releasing fragments of the original orders signed by Stalin and Beria. But even then, much remained hidden. The full archival record of the massacre, especially details of the execution logistics and burial operations, remains classified in Russian archives to this day. What makes Katyn so haunting is not only the atrocity itself, but the decades of denial that followed. This was not a forgotten massacre. It was an actively suppressed one. Governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain participated in its erasure, either through propaganda or silence. The Polish elite, who could have rebuilt their nation, were systematically executed, their memory buried under lies. The Allied governments, in turn, chose expedience over truth, sacrificing justice on the altar of wartime necessity. Even after the war, during the Cold War standoff, Katyn remained a bargaining chip, a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. To walk today through the Katyn forest is to tread on sacred ground. Memorial crosses mark the sites, rows of plaques bearing names of officers, priests, and professors. Yet the silence of decades lingers, a reminder that history is not only shaped by what happened, but by what was hidden. Katyn was not merely a massacre, it was a lesson in how power manipulates truth, how alliances dictate memory, and how entire nations can be forced to live with lies. Each exhumed body tells a story not only of murder, but of betrayal, of families abandoned by the world in the name of diplomacy. It remains one of the darkest suppressed secrets of the Second World War, a file that governments tried to bury, but which the earth itself refused to keep hidden. Hidden chemical weapons testing grounds. As the guns of the Second World War thundered across continents, another quieter arms race unfolded in secret facilities, hidden behind barbed wire and military censorship. While tanks and bombers dominated the headlines, governments were preparing for a war fought with invisible killers, chemical and biological weapons designed to wipe out armies or cripple entire cities. Officially, such weapons had been outlawed by the Geneva Protocol of 1925, but in practice, the great powers were racing to perfect them. The public was told nothing. Deep in the deserts of Utah, the British countryside, and occupied lands in Asia, experiments were carried out on soldiers, prisoners, and unsuspecting civilians. Classified files revealed test ranges soaked in mustard gas, animals dissolved by nerve agents, and secret stockpiles built in preparation for a final apocalyptic showdown. These were not defensive trials alone. They were rehearsals for mass extermination, rehearsals that governments later denied ever took place. Britain's nerve centre for this work was Porton Down, a sprawling research base in Wiltshire that still operates today. Beginning in the early 1940s, scientists there tested mustard gas, lewisite, and later the terrifying nerve agent sarin. Soldiers were recruited for what they were told were mild respiratory trials, only to be locked in chambers filled with toxic vapors. Many collapsed, vomiting blood, their skin blistering as chemical burns ate into their flesh. Declassified British Army reports admit that by 1945, over 20,000 servicemen had been subjected to gas experiments. Some died within hours, others lived with permanent damage to lungs and eyes, their cases quietly dismissed as unrelated illnesses. The British government denied for decades that these men were used as guinea pigs, but the paper trail of military medical records, stamped most secret, tells another story. Across the Atlantic, the United States ran similar programs at WWII Proving Ground in Utah, Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, and on remote Pacific islands. At WWII, entire fields were drenched with mustard gas and VX precursors, while sheep and livestock were tethered down to measure the effects. The desert air carried the poison for miles, contaminating soil and water. In 1945, US forces prepared thousands of mustard gas shells and bombs for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. Documents marked Eyes Only confirm that if the atomic bomb had failed to secure surrender, chemical warfare on a massive scale was ready to begin. Japan's cities, already burned by firebombing, could have been drowned in clouds of choking gas. Civilians were not excluded from the target lists. The reality that tens of thousands more would have perished in chemical agony was erased from post-war narratives of victory. The Soviets, too, maintained vast stockpiles. Captured German chemical plants were dismantled and shipped east after 1945, including facilities at Daihan-Fürth, where the Nazis had mass-produced tabun, one of the first nerve agents. NKVD units transported both equipment and scientists to secure the knowledge for Moscow. Test sites in Siberia and Central Asia were established, their locations erased from maps. Villagers near Semipalatinsk whispered of livestock dying overnight, of rivers turning foul after mysterious military convoys arrived. Soviet documents remain heavily classified, but fragments reveal field tests with sarin and soman conducted throughout the late 1940s. The pattern was global secrecy, each nation hiding its programs, each preparing for a chemical apocalypse that thankfully never came to pass. Perhaps the darkest of all records come from the Far East. Japan's Unit 731, based in occupied Manchuria, conducted biological warfare experiments on prisoners that rivaled the horrors of the Nazi camps. Prisoners were exposed to plague-infected fleas, anthrax and cholera, their deaths meticulously recorded. Victims were dissected without anesthesia to track the spread of disease. Entire villages were infected as field trials. Yet what remains most disturbing is how this information was handled after Japan's surrender. US intelligence officers, led by General Douglas MacArthur, struck secret deals with Unit 731's leaders, offering immunity from prosecution in exchange for their data. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal never mentioned these crimes in detail. Instead, the files were shipped to Fort Detrick in Maryland, home of America's biological warfare program. For decades, Washington denied any collaboration, but declassified correspondence in the 1990s confirmed the bargain. The knowledge gained through unspeakable suffering was preserved, while the perpetrators lived in comfort, their victims erased from official history. The legacy of these programs did not end with the war. In the 1950s and 1960s, veterans who had been exposed to chemical agents at Porton Down and Edgewood began reporting mysterious illnesses. Many were told their conditions were unrelated, their records missing or falsified. Families of men who died during trials were given vague explanations about unexpected medical complications. Only after relentless legal battles in the late 20th century did some governments admit wrongdoing, offering compensation decades too late. Even then, the full scope of experiments remains redacted. Pages are missing from files, witness statements censored. Survivors describe being warned never to speak, under threat of imprisonment for breaching the Official Secrets Act. Evidence suggests that chemical warfare almost became reality on several occasions. In 1944, as Allied armies prepared for D-Day, Hitler's generals debated unleashing stockpiles of tabun and mustard gas to halt the invasion. They hesitated, fearing Allied retaliation. What they did not know was that the Allies had prepared chemical weapons of their own, ready to drench Normandy's beaches if necessary. Later, in the Pacific, Operation Downfall's chemical components stood by as a backup should the atomic bomb not force surrender. The world was closer to chemical warfare than most histories admit. The fact that these plans were hidden for so long underscores how devastating the truth would have been to national myths of just war. The physical evidence still lingers. At Dugway, decades after the war, toxic waste ponds were found seeping into the soil. In Wiltshire, farmers reported fields where nothing grew for years, residues of secret trials. In the Russian countryside, rusting canisters have been unearthed. Their markings faded, but their contents still deadly. Each site is a reminder of how governments buried not only documents, but landscapes poisoned by ambition. Official reports sanitized the past, but the earth itself remembers. To speak of hidden chemical weapons testing grounds is to confront a silence maintained by every major power of the 20th century. These were not fringe experiments, nor the work of rogue scientists. They were systematic, state-sanctioned programs carried out in the name of survival, but at the cost of truth and humanity. Governments chose to erase the evidence, to protect reputations, and to shield themselves from accusations of hypocrisy. After all, how could the liberators condemn Nazi crimes while quietly benefiting from similar methods? The hypocrisy was buried alongside the victims, in files marked top secret and storage sites fenced off from view. Even today, much of this history remains classified. Veterans who participated in trials still seek recognition. Families of Japanese victims of Unit 731 still demand acknowledgement. And researchers comb archives where folders remain sealed, their contents withheld under claims of national security. The question is not whether these atrocities happened. They did. The question is, how much longer governments can deny the full truth? For every missing document, every erased file number, there is a survivor, a family, or a scarred landscape that testifies against silence. The hidden grounds of chemical warfare remind us that history is not just written, it is concealed, redacted, and buried. And in the darkness of that concealment lies the most disturbing truth of all. The world we live in was shaped by crimes we were never meant to know. Disturbing secret alliances with war criminals. When the world watched the Nuremberg trials unfold in 1945, the image projected was one of absolute justice. The victors of the Second World War promised to hold perpetrators of genocide, mass murder, and aggressive war to account. Righteous speeches filled the courtrooms. Cameras captured stern judges and defiant defendants. Their sentences broadcast as the ultimate triumph of morality over barbarism. Yet behind those grand displays, another reality was already taking shape. In the shadows of intelligence services and secret diplomatic corridors, many of the very men who orchestrated atrocities were quietly recruited, protected, or resettled. They were too valuable, their skills too useful, and their knowledge too dangerous to waste. While the public saw gallows and prison cells, hidden networks of former Nazis and fascists were being woven into the machinery of the Cold War. It was a betrayal dressed as pragmatism, a moral compromise that governments insisted would never be revealed. One of the most notorious programs was Operation Paperclip, officially launched by the United States in 1945. While its public face centered on recruiting rocket engineers like Wernher von Braun, responsible for the V-2 missiles that devastated London, the reality was far broader. Documents declassified in the 1990s revealed that dozens of men with direct ties to slave labor camps, weapons testing on prisoners, and even SS command structures were quietly brought to America. They were given new identities, sanitized employment records, and safe homes, all in exchange for their expertise in rocketry, aviation medicine, and chemical warfare. At Fort Bliss, Texas, and later at NASA, these men walked freely, their past erased. Their victims' cries were drowned beneath the roar of rockets lifting American prestige into the skies. Britain ran similar efforts under operations with names like Surgeon and Matchbox, recruiting former German scientists, pilots, and intelligence officers. Some were installed in RAF facilities to help analyze jet propulsion, while others provided intelligence on the Soviet Union. MI6 maintained contact with men who had once been Gestapo operatives in Eastern Europe, repurposing them as agents to destabilize communist regimes. Files uncovered in the National Archives confirm payments made to individuals directly implicated in massacres of civilians. Yet these names never appeared in official histories. They were footnotes scrubbed clean, replaced with the illusion of pure resistance against tyranny. The Vatican played its part through what later became known as the rat lines. Using church networks, monasteries, and sympathetic priests, hundreds of Nazi officials escaped justice and found new lives in South America. Argentina under Juan Perón became a safe haven. Men like Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust's deportations, and Josef Mengele, the angel of death from Auschwitz, slipped across the ocean with forged Red Cross papers. Many of these routes were coordinated with tacit support from Western intelligence, which viewed South America as a useful staging ground against Soviet influence. The moral corruption of allowing mass murderers to live in peace was justified under the cloak of anti-communist strategy. Only decades later, when Eichmann was captured in Buenos Aires by Israeli agents, did the world realize how deeply these networks had operated. Perhaps the most disturbing revelations come from operations codenamed Gladio and Bloodstone, clandestine Cold War programs designed to build stay-behind armies in case of Soviet invasion. In practice, this meant recruiting former SS and collaborationist militias in Eastern Europe. Men who had participated in ethnic cleansings and village massacres during the war were now armed and funded by Western agencies. CIA memoranda from the late 1940s explicitly refer to the need for hardened anti-communist elements, regardless of their past affiliations. These covert armies engaged in sabotage, assassinations, and psychological warfare. For civilians caught in their crossfire, the liberation promised in 1945 felt no different from occupation. Governments denied their existence, dismissing reports as conspiracy theories, until declassified documents in the 1990s confirmed what survivors had always whispered. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union engaged in similar practices. The NKVD captured former Gestapo and Wehrmacht officers, offering them reduced sentences in exchange for intelligence and collaboration. Some of these men later resurfaced as enforcers in communist states, brutalizing their own populations with methods they had once used under the swastika. For Moscow, ideology was less important than utility. The world had been divided into spheres of influence, and within those spheres, morality was a tool, not a principle. The betrayal extended even to victims of the Holocaust. In displaced persons camps across Germany, survivors discovered that former SS guards lived in the same barracks, protected by falsified documents. Jewish refugees who tried to expose them were often silenced, their claims dismissed as paranoia. In America, Eastern European collaborators who had overseen deportations were granted citizenship under new names, integrated into suburban life. Decades later, investigative journalists uncovered their identities, sparking trials in the 1980s and 1990s, yet by then, many had lived comfortable lives for 40 years, shielded by the silence of governments who once called themselves liberators. The files reveal a stark truth. Justice at Nuremberg was selective. For every man executed, others were quietly recycled into new uniforms, new agencies, new missions. Their knowledge of Soviet military structures, guerrilla tactics, or advanced technology was deemed more important than their crimes. National security was the excuse, but beneath it lay a willingness to erase history when it proved inconvenient. Documents stamped classified concealed the contradictions of a post-war order that claimed moral victory while feeding on the remnants of evil. The consequences of these alliances were profound. In South America, networks of Nazi fugitives trained death squads that later terrorized their own populations. In Europe, stay-behind armies committed false flag attacks blamed on communist groups, manipulating public opinion. In the United States, the presence of Nazi scientists at NASA became a source of scandal when journalists uncovered their pasts, forcing embarrassed officials to defend decisions made decades earlier. Each revelation chipped away at the myth of unblemished victory, exposing the moral compromises that underpinned the Cold War world. To speak of disturbing secret alliances with war criminals is to acknowledge that history is not a simple tale of good triumphing over evil. It is a record of bargains struck in smoke-filled rooms, of files hidden in classified cabinets, of murderers who escaped justice because their skills were too valuable to waste. Governments buried the truth not only to protect their reputations, but to preserve the fragile image of post-war unity. Yet the truth leaked, piece by piece, until the silence could no longer hold. Each declassified document, each survivor's testimony, forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that victory was compromised, and justice selectively applied. The gallows at Nuremberg may have silenced some, but many more walked free, welcomed, protected, and even celebrated in the very nations that claimed to fight for humanity. Suppressed atrocities of Allied bombing campaigns. Amid the ruins of Europe and Asia, the official narrative of Allied air power was one of precision and necessity, strategic strikes that crippled enemy industry and shortened the war. Yet behind this carefully constructed image lies a record far more troubling. Entire cities were reduced not simply to rubble, but to charred wastelands by firestorms deliberately engineered to spread beyond military targets. Civilian neighborhoods, schools, and hospitals were engulfed in flames so intense that asphalt streets melted and people seeking shelter suffocated in underground bunkers. Governments later justified these attacks as essential to ending the war. But the truth, buried in suppressed reports and sealed archives, tells of a different calculus. These campaigns were not accidents. They were experiments in destruction, designed to test how much terror and devastation human society could withstand. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 stands as one of the most haunting examples. Over the course of 3 nights, British and American bombers dropped thousands of tons of high explosive and incendiary devices on a city packed with refugees fleeing the Eastern Front. Dresden was known for its architecture, museums, and cultural heritage. Its military value was minimal, yet planners at RAF Bomber Command, under Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, selected it as a target for its potential to collapse German morale. The result was a firestorm so intense that temperatures exceeded 1,500 degrees Celsius. Eyewitnesses described hurricane-force winds pulling people into flames, bodies fused together in molten streets, and entire families incinerated in cellars. Official estimates later spoke of 25,000 dead, but internal documents suggest the true toll may have been far higher. For decades, governments downplayed the scale, censoring photographs and reducing civilian casualties to footnotes in official histories. Hamburg had already suffered a similar fate in 1943 under Operation Gomorrah, when Allied bombers unleashed incendiary raids that created the first man-made firestorm of the war. The inferno consumed whole districts, killing at least 37,000 people. Survivors recalled a sky turning blood red, with children pulled from their mothers by the suction of burning winds. The destruction was so complete that even hardened Wehrmacht soldiers wept upon entering the ruins. Yet Bomber Command celebrated the raid as proof of morale bombing, a doctrine that saw civilian suffering as a weapon of war. Classified memos circulated within the Air Ministry openly debated which German cities were most vulnerable to firestorm creation, identifying architectural density, weather patterns, and fuel supplies as critical factors. These were not unintended tragedies, they were calculated strategies. Across the world, in March 1945, Tokyo endured the single most destructive air raid of the war. Operation Meeting House saw US B-29 bombers drop hundreds of thousands of incendiary cluster bombs over wooden residential districts. Napalm and magnesium filled the night sky, igniting one of history's greatest firestorms. Over 100,000 civilians perished in a matter of hours, burned alive, drowned in boiling canals, or crushed beneath collapsing homes. General Curtis LeMay, architect of the US firebombing campaign, later admitted, "If we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals." Yet his words were kept quiet. Buried beneath the celebration of Japan's eventual surrender, the photographs of Tokyo's charred children and blackened corpses were deemed too disturbing for public release, locked away in military archives for decades. What makes these campaigns more disturbing is the evidence of plans that went even further. Declassified RAF memoranda from 1944 reveal discussions about chemical dispersal operations, where mustard gas or phosgene could be dropped on German cities. US Air Force files outline scenarios for flooding Japanese rice fields to induce famine, or targeting dikes and dams to drown civilians en masse. None of these were carried out, but the fact they were seriously considered shows how far strategic bombing planners were willing to push the boundaries of legality and morality. These proposals remained hidden, excised from post-war histories to preserve the image of the Allies as liberators rather than perpetrators of mass destruction. Governments also manipulated casualty figures. In Britain, Bomber Command reports often rounded civilian deaths downward to avoid public backlash. In the United States, detailed surveys of bombing damage in Japan were classified and released only in heavily redacted form. Survivors' testimonies, women describing children turned to ash in their arms, men pulling skeletal remains from ruins, were deemed unsuitable for publication. The voices of those who endured the infernos were erased, ensuring that future generations remembered the air raids only as stepping stones to victory. Those who attempted to question the morality of bombing, including dissenting MPs in Britain and officers within the US Army Air Forces, found their objections silenced, their reports buried in restricted archives. The suppression extended even into post-war tribunals. At Nuremberg, Allied prosecutors deliberately avoided charges related to area bombing. German defendants attempted to raise the destruction of Dresden and Hamburg as parallels to their own crimes, but the court ruled such arguments inadmissible. Justice was applied selectively. Mass killing from the air, when conducted by the victors, was excluded from scrutiny. Official histories published in the 1950s and 1960s cemented this silence, portraying bombing campaigns as necessary evils that shortened the war. The moral ambiguity was erased, replaced by narratives of precision and righteousness. Yet the truth lingers in the ruins and in the memories of survivors. Dresden's charred Frauenkirche stood as a hollow shell for decades, a silent monument to destruction. In Tokyo, blackened foundations still mark districts that were never rebuilt. Families in Hamburg continue to unearth burned bones when new buildings are constructed. These physical remnants resist suppression, bearing witness to what official documents tried to conceal. Even today, scholars who study firestorm tactics must navigate archives where entire folders remain missing, casualty reports reduced to sanitized tables, and photographs deliberately mislabeled. The phrase, "suppressed atrocities of Allied bombing campaigns," is not hyperbole. It reflects a calculated effort to shape history, to present the victors as unblemished while burying evidence of actions that blurred the line between military necessity and terror. By suppressing these atrocities, governments sought to protect their moral authority, to prevent future generations from questioning the righteousness of their cause. Yet the hidden files, the redacted reports, and the silent ruins speak for themselves. They tell us that victory was not pure, and that the firestorms of Dresden, Hamburg, and Tokyo were not accidents of war, but deliberate acts of mass destruction. The greatest crime was not only the burning of cities, but the erasure of memory. ensuring that for decades the victims were denied their place in history's record. Only by confronting these suppressed truths can the full story of the war be understood, and only then can the silence finally be broken. Beneath the carefully constructed myths of liberation and righteous victory lies a silence that continues to echo through time. The hidden files we have opened, fragments of experiments erased, massacres denied, weapons tested in secrecy, alliances forged with the unthinkable, and cities incinerated under a curtain of lies, force us to confront an unsettling truth. History, as we know it, is not the full record, but the edited version chosen for us by those who stood to gain from omission. Governments swore to protect their nations, yet in doing so, they concealed crimes that reshaped morality, diplomacy, and the post-war order itself. As these secrets surface, they raise urgent questions that remain unanswered. What else still lies buried in sealed vaults, in files marked classified until 2075, or in archives quietly destroyed before anyone could see them? Were these 5 only the beginning of a far larger pattern, a history written in shadows rather than light? The silence is breaking, but only in fragments, and so, the question is left to you. Which of these truths unsettles you most, and how many more remain hidden, waiting to surface when the next locked cabinet is finally opened?